A new set of transformation laws for South Africa is slated for implementation by this year. So basically this means that organizations, especially those that do business with the state, will have to be in good standing when it comes to compliance with employment equity. The Department of Labor says designated employers need to submit their annual 2022 EE reports by the 15th of January 2023 at midnight. That's sure 2 days from now. Failure to do so could see businesses face fines and other penalties. Let's talk a little bit more about this. And joining us via Zoom, we've got employment equity specialist at Strata G, Teboho Motsoane. Great to have you, Teboho. Thanks so much for being our guest.
Morning, Leanne, and morning to our viewers this morning.
Let's start off right at the beginning. So we know that there's a brand new set of transformation laws that are coming into effect this year. But perhaps you can help us unpack them very briefly.
Okay, sure. So ultimately, there's been a lot of anticipation within the sector, obviously, while we wait for the Employment Equity Amendment Bill to be promulgated. In very short, I think first and foremost, currently employers have the choice and mandates to sort of draft their own goals and targets where the employment equity plans are applicable. So at the current moment in time, the most impactful change we're seeing in terms of the bill is that it's going to give the Minister of Labour the authority and discretion to set sector-specific targets. Now, whilst we don't yet know what those targets are going to look like, there's obviously quite a lot of anticipation in terms of, is there going to be a transition period that's actually going to be set aside for designated employers to actually comply with the new regulations, or what exactly it's going to look like. Another big change, of course, is the fact that they're now specifically going to target your entities that are larger than 50 employees, meaning that they're now looking at taking the compliance burden off your smaller entities that are purely complying at this present moment in time based on turnover.
Okay, so that's kind of what we can expect. Now, the big story is the fact that there are procedures that employers need to follow to submit their 2022 annual employment equity report. So what are they? And the deadline is 2 sleeps away.
100%. So we're literally looking at a deadline that's 48 hours away. So the compliance process is one that is quite particular in that it's obviously governed by various sections of the Employment Equity Act. But ultimately, we're looking at things like, has the employer consulted with their committees? In terms of the committees, there obviously has to be a very specific way in which the committees are set up so that there isn't any form of discrimination in that groups that are represented within the workforce are not being excluded. That platform on its own will then form as a consultative forum where employers will then engage with their committee members, where they will then bring forward in terms of what exactly has transpired in the business, giving an overview of the workforce profile, giving an overview of who's come into the business from a recruitment perspective, who's been terminated. Another question would be, what does the employment analysis look like? Have you reviewed your barriers? Which of course will then inform your affirmative action measures. So even before the submission in itself can actually be done, there's actually quite a lot of procedures or processes that actually need to be put in place.
I mean, what about legal advice? Because I can imagine that a lot of employees would need a bit of legal advice when compiling this EE report.
So in terms of legal advice, it really would depend on what I would refer to as what the capabilities of your current employment equity champion look like. Ultimately, we always strongly recommend that in the event that there isn't someone who's a specialist or who's a fait with the Employment Equity Act and the regulations contained therein, that of course then you seek to getting legal advice. In that way, another important thing is to mitigate any sort of risks in terms of submitting information that could potentially be inaccurate. And that's actually one of the major things that prompts Department of Employment and Labour inspections or Director General reviews. So obviously having a legal expert or advice makes the process far easier, in that obviously specialists are then able to take over the entire compliance process on your behalf, or rather give you advice as to, what types of blind spots should you then look out for, that will then safeguard you against any sort of penalties that you may incur.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about those penalties. I mean, what will be imposed on businesses that fail to submit these reports?
So at the current moment, and at the current present moment, we're looking at penalties that would range anything from 1.5 million rand or up to 10% of the organization's turnover in the event where the organization has been found to be non-compliant for a number of occasions. The CEO or the most senior person may even face imprisonment.
Gee whiz. All right. So this is a very, very tough one, and one that needs to, and most importantly, I mean, it's also the fact that if you're not in good standing, and if that report is not submitted and cleared, chances are that, especially if you're wanting to do work with a state, with the government, you're not going to get that job. This needs to be in good standing in order to qualify. Is that correct, my understanding?
100%. So one of the amendments, as governed under Section 53, is that they are going to be issuing certificates of compliance that will not only give you a foot in the door in terms of being compliant or doing business with government, but that on its own may also serve as your passport, if you would call it, to actually doing business overall in South Africa. So that's also one of the main things that we're actually looking at, or that we wait for in terms of the amendment bill to see, in terms of issuing the employment equity compliance certificate. Of course, that's quite important for a lot of entities, or will be important for a lot of entities.
Is there a way of determining the status of employment equity in South Africa? What does the picture look like currently?
Wow. So the biggest informative document one would look at that is actually issued on an annual basis is the Commission for the Employment Equity Report. So last year, the 22nd Commission for Employment Equity Report was submitted. So let's look at it right at the present moment in time. We are 25 years into the Employment Equity Act being promulgated. What the report has reflected is that in the 2021 EE reporting cycle, it still shows an average or trend in that there's a 1% reduction of our white population group being represented at our top occupational levels. So we're actually looking at your top management, your senior management, and your middle management levels. Over and above that on its own just says that even though we've got this beautiful piece of legislation in place, that the rate at which transformations occurring is actually not where it should be. There should actually be far more equitable representation within South Africa, where your previously disadvantaged individuals are actually more represented at your higher levels.
Yeah. And do you feel that this new law will perhaps refine that? Will it sort of do what it is intended to do? I mean, we've been trying for many, many years, but do you think this could be the turning point?
Well, based on what we've seen alone, I mean, within my space in the last 24 months, we've averaged, call it 2 Director General reviews a month, and that is now the bare minimum. So based on that alone, we're actually seeing far more activity coming through from the inspector, from the Department of Labour. And that on its own prompts us to say that the legislation is definitely being taken far more seriously. The fact that we are seeing statistics of this nature, where our designated groups are still highly underrepresented in your higher levels, also then shows us that the department's definitely pushing to ensure that there's compliance and that transformation is essentially taking place within South Africa. I mean, if you look at it holistically, without the transformative measures being put in place, we're still going to be faced with high levels of inequality, where people are living in dire cases of poverty, where people are uneducated and are just not getting those opportunities, or rather we will still be faced with those barriers to entry. So based on the number of Director General reviews we've seen and the high activity of engagement coming through from the Department of Labour and the inspectors, we see that as the build-up towards the Employment Equity Bill being promulgated. At the current moment in time, I know that it's been passed by the National Assembly in Parliament and is currently awaiting Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa's approval, and that's obviously also been shown in a number of media releases. So we'll wait and see when the 1st of September comes, which is the proposed date that's actually been given at the current moment in time. What will those changes look like, and where will it then put designated employers, and overall, where will it put South Africans from a compliance perspective?
All right, Teboho, thank you. Thanks for giving us that great explanation and of course, talking to us about penalties that are going to be imposed on companies that do not get their EE reports in. And you've got 48 hours in order to do that. So Teboho is an employment equity specialist at Strata G.